This is the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast. Agoro Carbon Alliance is taking action on a global scale to reverse the effects of climate change by decarbonizing farming and restoring carbon to the world's soil. On this podcast, we're going to explore carbon farming from the soil to the atmosphere and how it affects everyone in between. To learn more, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com. Thanks for joining another edition of the Carbon Farming Podcast with Agoro Carbon Alliance. We have another great episode today, one with Caleb Smith. He's based out of Newcastle, Indiana, and is an agronomist working for Agoro Carbon Alliance. Caleb, after working in the hybrid seed production and as a research agronomist, why did you decide to join the Agoro Carbon Alliance and worry about carbon sequestration?
Sure. Yeah. So Scott, first off, very happy to be on the pod. But yeah, for me, it's always been trying to get into the sustainability space. That's always what I've been drawn to in the world of agronomy is the sustainability space, because that's really where this space has to go in the future. You know, the future of agriculture is sustainability. As someone that grew up in rural small town America, anything I can do to help preserve rural small town America, you know, I'm very happy to do that. And that's, you know, at my role at Agoro, that's exactly what I see myself doing. And that's what Agoro really is functioning to do, is we're helping increase the longevity and the chances that these farms will be around in 100 years.
Caleb, sustainability is a word that sometimes we throw around without really thinking about what that means. In your experience, what does sustainability mean for the farmer?
Yeah, so at Agoro Carbon, we are sometimes guilty of thinking about sustainability myopically as being carbon, right? If we increase our soil carbon, we're increasing our sustainability. But to me, we have to look at it from maybe a much wider lens. We can't increase soil carbon at the expense of releasing other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide. So for me, it's finding ways to holistically manage farms in a way that really mimics nature. Not to say that we have to get away from all external inputs, because some things like herbicides, for example, are actually really critical to no-till working. So it's a trade-off, right? I try not to be one side, against outside inputs and outside chemicals versus the other side wanting to do things completely holistically and organically. I think it has to be somewhere in the middle to make the biggest difference in terms of actually fighting climate change. There's going to be some sort of a trade-off. It's not going to be one or the other all the time.
And farmers and ranchers, in my experience, are the best jugglers of all of these things, the balancing act. There has to be profitability on farm in order for them to do some of these sustainability things. And I think that's where Agoro comes in, that kind of helps a grower make some of these changes that will pay off in the future with profit up front so that they can make those changes. Do you mind talking about that a little bit, how Agoro helps that process work?
Yeah, so one of the biggest constraints of scaling up regenerative agriculture is that it can sometimes take an upfront cost, and there can sometimes be a learning curve, and that learning curve can result in maybe a profit loss initially. So Agoro it really wants to help farmers switch to these sustainable practices and switch to these regenerative practices, but remain profitable. If the grower does not remain profitable, they have no incentive to keep doing these practices that are better for the environment. So if the profitability is not there, it's a non-starter. So upfront payments and carbon payments are a great way to augment, some of the cost of implementing things like cover crops and no-till. It's not going to cover all of it, but it's going to make a big dent in it for sure.
Before we get into some of the details surrounding that, tell us a little bit about why is carbon sequestration so important now and possibly in the future? Why are we worrying about it now? Why are there so many companies that are getting into this? Why is it such a hot topic in our agricultural discussions?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is that information is so readily available. And a lot of the information around climate change and a lot of the data around climate change is really undeniable. And as more people begin to be aware of this, they start to understand that we as a society have to change our behavior. You know, I'm sure a lot of the listeners of this podcast are familiar with how we got in this situation. Over the last 300 or so years since the Industrial Revolution, the human population has really boomed and increased. And as a result, emissions have gone unchecked. So as a result of those unchecked emissions, we have a really adverse effect on our climate, a really negative effect on our climate. And this looks like warmer weather. It looks like rising sea level thanks to glaciers melting. And really, in terms of agriculture, it comes down to doing two things, really. And two things are why it's so vital. One of them is we actually need to regenerate a lot of our depleted agro ecosystems. Traditional agriculture practices, not that they made up a lot of our emissions, they only make up about 10% of our annual emissions, But a lot of these traditional practices have resulted in the depletion of a lot of our productivity, of our natural productivity and our natural microbiome of our soils and agroecosystems. So the second thing is we need to prevent negative consequences. So in addition to regenerating our agroecosystems, we have to prevent negative consequences around production. And what I mean by that is that climate change is going to affect different parts of the world differently. And specifically in the Corn Belt, where most of our corn is grown and most of our crops are grown in the U.S. and in a row crop setting, what has happened in the last 70 or so years is it's been gradually getting warmer. A recent study from University of Nebraska and Lincoln, actually, that came out in January of 2022, what they looked at, well, they wanted to know why corn yields in the Corn Belt were increasing so much. Is it technology? Is it genetics? Is it better management? And what they found was that a big part of it is actually climate. During the last 70 or so years, climate change has created a climate that's really conducive to corn production and crop production. But the issue is that this is only temporary. It's not going to stop getting warmer when corn and soybeans reach their maximum temperature threshold. And at that point, it's going to become really hard to grow crops profitably. And that's going to have serious consequences on the Corn Belt specifically. So really, for me, fighting climate change is about preserving not just our agroecosystems, but our rural communities. And reducing agriculture's carbon footprint is really a critical first step in making sure that our small rural communities are still here for our grandkids and their grandkids.
So, Caleb, the question that just comes to mind as you're explaining that is, yeah, that feels good.
Mm-hmm.
If we're doing some things that are going to reduce carbon emissions or maybe store more carbon in the soil, which is also good for the farm as well, can we actually reduce or curve the change in the climate that is going? I mean, the big curve of climate change, can we actually move that so that it reverses?
Sure, yeah. Assuming that 100% of the world's row crops are planted with cover crops and no-till, that's still not going to be enough. It's an important part of it, but we have to do things across all different, types of industry. We have to decrease our emissions and also increase the amount of carbon we're pulling out of the atmosphere. So it's a two-pronged attack. We have to change our behavior, change the way we make products to decrease our emissions, and change our behavior to do things to sequester carbon when we're farming. So it's really a two-pronged attack.
And how does Agoro play into this change? How is the Agoro Carbon Alliance incentivizing or helping growers make the changes that are necessary to help with this climate change?
Yeah, sure. So really, a lot of the skeptics of the carbon market will talk about how complex it is for farmers to enroll. Agoro's response to that was, let's create a carbon program that's extremely simple, extremely transparent, and extremely farmer-friendly. And as you know, we don't require our growers to buy anything. We don't have anything to sell. All we do is carbon. So what Agoro functions to do is partner with farmers and really be an alliance for farmers and really folks across the entire industry that maybe want to have a positive effect on the climate through carbon sequestration. So when we partner with our farmers, we're agreeing to do all the soil sampling for them. We're agreeing to do all the work with verifying the credits and selling the credits. And then we pay them a fair value for those credits. And for them, it's very headache-free. They can focus on farming, which is what they do best.
Caleb, we're incentivizing growers to make these changes and to sequester carbon and produce carbon credits. I don't see carbon credits. It's not like growing corn. How do we find or how do we measure these carbon credits so that we can put a dollar amount to those and make a profit for the farm?
Yeah, so most carbon aggregators like Agoro have one of two ways of doing this. They can either model the changes in carbon or they can physically measure it. And Agoro uses a combination of both because that's what gives us the most power to actually detect significant changes that are real. So basically, like I said, it's a 10-year contract. Prior to the grower starting whatever carbon farming practice he's going to do or she's going to do, we come in and measure their carbon at year zero in their soil. So we come in and we measure the carbon stock. And basically, this uses bulk density as well as total organic carbon. We can use those numbers to extrapolate how many tons of carbon exist on an acre down to a certain depth. What we'll do is we'll come back after year 5 and then again at year 10 and take measurements in the same locations. And those locations are stratified according to soil variables that influence carbon storage, things like clay content, landscape position, soil organic matter content. And this really allows us to accurately detect changes. And we also can utilize modeling to help make these sampling efforts a bit less intensive. And this lowers the cost for everyone and also improves the accuracy. So a combination of modeling and physical sampling is really critical to determine that these changes are real.
How does reducing the tillage and implementing cover crops increase the carbon sequestration on farm? How does that all work?
Yeah, so first we have to think about what is carbon sequestration? What is terrestrial carbon sequestration? There's really two parts to that equation. The first thing we have to do is we have to increase the amount of biomass production in a given land area. So we have to increase the amount of carbon coming into the system via photosynthesis of plants, which cover crops are an optimal way to do that. The second thing is we have to decrease the loss of carbon that's already in the soil. And that is where reducing your tillage comes into play. Traditionally, farmers till their soil because it creates a really optimal planting condition for the cash crop. The issue is that it results in an over-mineralization of the carbon that's in that soil. Some mineralization is necessary, but when we till, we over-mineralize and we lose too much carbon, and it's not necessary. Really, one of the most important ways that carbon is stored in the soil is through physical isolation in soil aggregates. So these aggregates that are around 50 microns in size have pore spaces in them. And soil carbon that's in various stages, so plant residue, microbial residues, can be entrapped within the aggregates in the pore space of those aggregates. And when we till the soil, it breaks up those aggregates, and they're vulnerable to mineralization by microbes. So really, it's like I said, it's increase the amount of carbon coming in, decrease the amount of carbon coming out. Cover crops and no tillage are a really good way to do this. And with cover crops, a lot of people just think, well, why can't I just leave my cash crop residue on the surface? Well, when we're talking about storing carbon, we're really talking about the roles of living roots. So root litter decomposition is about 30% slower than leaf litter decomposition. So it's really critical that we have living roots with cover crops because most of our carbon that's stored in the soil actually comes from below ground inputs, not above ground inputs. For those reasons, cover crops and no tillage are a great first step in increasing soil carbon.
What if you have a grower out there or a rancher that has already implemented some of these changes, whether that's no-till, low-till, and cover crops, because it's good for the farm and good for profit on the farm? What if they've already implemented that and now they're looking to say, okay, I want to take advantage of this other profit or revenue generating capability with carbon credits? Can they join in, or are they penalized because they've been doing this for a couple of years, let's say?
Yeah. So once again, skeptics of the carbon market like to talk about this. It's additionality. The buyers of these credits want the credits to only be sequestered because there was a contract in place to do so. Therefore, a grower that's been no-tilling cover cropping for the last 20 years is not eligible to sign up with no-tillage or cover crops. However, there are always things that you can do that are additional. There's always additional practices you can take on that will result in additional carbon storage. And animal agriculture comes into play here because a lot of our growers have gotten away in the United States, have gotten away from animal production. We have growers that are really good at raising animals and growers that are really good at raising row crops. One of the things that really needs to happen in order to make climate change mitigation through agriculture real is we have to get better at introducing animals back onto the farm, especially ruminant livestock like cattle. One of the things that growers maybe that have planted cover crops, have been no-tilling, one of the things they can do to qualify is actually start grazing cattle on their row crop land. That will qualify for a carbon program. And Agoro continues to investigate new practices. One of the things that's really important to us is finding ways to incentivize legacy growers who have already been doing the right things, because we do not want them to be penalized. So a big part of our efforts are finding new practices.
Right.
There's all kinds of these new things on the horizon that are being talked about to increase soil carbon, and we're really at the forefront of all of them.
Talk a little bit more about livestock integration onto the farm. I'm going to put my farmer hat on. Let's say I'm out in Indiana where you are, and I'm a corn grower, and I grow corn. I don't have any experience with livestock. How does that integration of livestock into my corn farming operation help with the soil dynamics and sequestration of carbon? And how do I do that when I don't have a lot of experience with livestock?
Yeah, that's going to be a challenge, right? But one of the things I talk about all the time that regenerative agriculture strives to do is mimic nature. One of the reasons that our Iowa soils and our mullock soils out west are so fertile is because at one point they had millions of bison roaming the land.
Right.
And Native Americans managed that land, and those bison moved. And as they moved, they deposited manure, and they didn't overgraze pastures. Pastures were never grazed down to the point there's nothing left. So for a farmer that is a traditional row crop farmer that wants to introduce livestock, one of the advantages of that is going to be a huge increase in fertility. As someone that already has livestock and that wants to introduce them into a row crop setting, it's going to help you save on feed costs. You can cut back the amount of hay you feed in the winter. There's all these other benefits, not only benefits for the row crops, but benefits for the animals. The animals are much happier when they're out grazing than when they are confined.
And so if I'm integrating livestock into my operation, am I Am I keeping them on the land all the time, or am I rotating the grazing areas, or how does that all work?
Sure. Adaptive multi-paddock grazing or rotational grazing can look like a lot of different things. We have some people who have perennial pastures that are always in pastures with perennial species, and they can make basically separate paddocks, and they move their livestock according to forage availability. So when one paddock has about 50% of the forage grazed, they move them onto another paddock where that past paddock can recover. If you're a row crop farmer, you might plant a cover crop maybe after harvest in October. And, hopefully by April, you'll have significant biomass and you can graze your cattle in April and May. And that saves you 2 months of time on the pasture. That's 2 months that your pasture can recover and be healthier. And then, of course, the 2 months the cattle are on the land, they're depositing manure. And manure is this really active, biologically active carbon, and it's also full of nitrogen and these other nutrients that plants need. So you can cut fertilizer costs. So, there's tons of downstream benefits when you're thinking about incorporating cattle.
And it's improving the soil properties, right? By incorporating these cattle and the manures, and it's helping improve the microbiome and wake the microbiology in the soil.
100%, yep.
What other soil properties influence that carbon storage?
Sure. So a big one is clay content. So most people know that clay content has a ton of reactive surface area. And then the soil carbon that's in various stages of decomposition can actually bind in a variety of different chemical interactions to that clay content, as well as some silt particles, smaller silt particles. Landscape position is another big one. If we think of our depressional areas that have really dark black soil because they're always waterlogged and microbes can't oxidize carbon away, so you're left with this really black muck-like soil. And then contrast to maybe like a clay top of a hill that's really void of carbon because essentially water drains out and there's all kinds of oxygen available for the microbes to oxidize away the carbon. Another one is climate. Climate's probably the biggest one. A combination of temperature and precipitation. Areas that are typically very cool or very humid. We think about the Alaska permafrost. We have plants that are well adept at growing, but microbes can't catch up to decompose that residue. So we're left with this abundance of carbon year after year. In contrast, we think about a place like the desert where we don't have the precipitation to create the primary productivity, so we don't have the rainfall to create the biomass. It's so warm that microbes essentially can always decompose the residue that's there because basically the temperature is not constrained. So it's a trade-off between a lot of different things. There's all kinds of different drivers and influencers of carbon storage. It's never just one thing like most things in nature.
This seems like a pretty long life cycle. How long does it actually take to sequester carbon?
Yeah, it really depends. So not to give you a typical science answer, but it truly depends. In some cases, you can see increases in soil carbon after 1 or 2 years.
Wow.
If you're practicing no-till, if you're really incorporating diverse cover crops, have a deep root structure, and you're doing all the right things, you can maybe sequester 0.5 to maybe 1 ton of carbon per acre per year. There's some cases where we look at literature that they found no increases in soil carbon after 5 or 6 years for a variety of different reasons. So it's not guaranteed that you're going to actually see increases in soil carbon. One of the things that Agoro does and functions to do is help our growers find ways to increase their chances of actually seeing an increase in carbon with agronomic best practices. It's not as simple as just no-tilling and cover cropping. There's a ton of stuff that also has to happen to make sure you have a positive outcome in terms of soil carbon movement.
You as a agronomist for Agoro, as you go out and meet with growers and producers and ranchers, are there certain fields or circumstances where you would say, this isn't going to work here? Or is it a blanket statement that regardless of where you live and what your land looks like, that there's an opportunity?
Yeah, so some of the early influencers of regenerative ag, people like Gabe Brown and Rick Clark, they will tell you that we can make cover crops and no-till work everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But with that being said, the carbon credits or the carbon market is not for every farmer. I tell farmers all the time, if you're thinking about changing your whole entire operation and you're doing something that you don't want to do, and it's going to sacrifice the way you feel about your farm just for an extra 20 or 15 bucks an acre, don't do it. It's not going to be worth it to you. I'm never going to try to convince someone to plant cover crops that doesn't truly see the value of cover crops for more than just carbon credit money. The carbon credit money is nice, but it pales in comparison to the agronomic benefits that you get when you're doing these things. So I tell people all the time, be invested in this for the right reasons. Don't be invested in this just for the extra $15 or $20 an acre from the carbon credit money.
That's one of the things that I've really enjoyed as I learn more about this carbon marketplace is, yes, there's a revenue generating aspect to this if you do it right and you join with a good company to measure the carbon that's being sequestered. But probably the bigger benefit for the farm and the profitability of the farm is you're improving the soil health and the sustainability, like you said at the top of the podcast, the sustainability of that land so that the profitability can last many, many decades or years or generations. And I think that's one of the cool things. What are some of the common misconceptions that you hear out there as you're meeting with customers?
Yeah, one of the big ones I can think of is that when we tell growers about who Agoro is, we say that, it's a 10-year contract. And they almost always say, well, I don't want to lock myself in for 10 years.
Right.
I don't want to lock myself into a price. When a grower signs up with Agoro, they're not locking themselves in. We have options in the contract. They can opt out prior to year 5 with no financial penalty, no problem. We also price match for the price of carbon with other companies. So our growers are never locking themselves into a price. If the price of carbon goes up, we will pay that additional price increase. And if one of our competitors is paying $30 a ton, we'll also pay $30 a ton. So that contract length and that carbon price are two of the biggest questions or the most common questions we get.
So Caleb, you've been working with Agoro Carbon Alliance for about a year now. Do you have any great stories of success so far in just that short amount of time that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, we have a company, we have set goals for ourselves for, the number of acres that we want to have and the number of people that we want to actually help service. And we've come pretty close to hitting those goals. And we've learned so much. With a market that's this new and that's in its infancy, we have a lot to learn. I think one of the things that makes Agoro so special is that we are agile. We can move, we can respond, we can figure out what growers want, what works for growers, and adjust according to what is best for them. The last thing we ever want to do is make a grower feel that they're getting locked into something or make them uncomfortable with us. So everything we do is for the betterment of the grower and it's for the ease of the grower.
If there's a grower out there or one of their advisors that's listening to this podcast and considering, hey, maybe this is something that interests me, where can they go to get more information, or what steps would you advise them to take at this point if they have some inkling of interest?
Sure. So you can go to our website at agorocarbonalliance.com and fill out a questionnaire. Anyone listening to this can feel free to email me at caleb.smith@agorocarbon.com. That's Caleb with a C, and ask me anything. I'm always happy to talk with anyone that wants to know.
I think that's one of the nice things that I've realized working with some of the sales agronomists at Agoro Carbon Alliance is it's very low pressure. They are mostly families that have also farmed. They relate with the growers and the ranchers out there, and they also want to do what's best for you, like a good agronomist would. Then we're not going to be pushy and sell you into something that is not good for your farm in the long term.
Sure.
So Caleb, I appreciate that. There's a lot of information. Best thing to do is reach out to one of our sales agronomists and just ask them questions and learn more about it, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. Mm-hmm. People may have different reactions to different phrases out there. The carbon marketplace, they may have a different perception of what that means and what they have to do. And maybe that's if they join up, they're sacrificing some of their long-term profitability and sustainability by doing something for a short-term gain, which is not the case.
Yep, absolutely.
Caleb, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. Again, if you have more questions, please reach out to agorocarbonalliance.com. In the show notes, there's also going to be a phone number that you can call and talk to somebody live there.
Scott, it's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast, where we bring you knowledge on how to sustainably and profitably transform farming through carbon cropping. To learn more about how you can become a partner, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com or follow us on our many social media channels: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn.